All right, good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon on the East Coast in the United States. Those of us joining us from abroad may have another time zone in mind. I am Brian Amkraut, the Executive Director of the Alora and Alvin Siegal Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third session in our four-part series held in conjunction with the Posen Library. We will have a little bit of an introduction to what the Posen Library is and what they do before I introduce our speakers for today, and we jump into our session on secularism and religious traditions. So thank you to the Posen Library for sharing that video with us. Want to mention that next week will be the final session in our series with the Posen Library. That will be with David Roskis and Samuel Casso, speaking about challenges to the establishment of a Jewish state. And today's session, again, to remind you, is we are joined by Zvi Gitelman and TODD M, who will be speaking on secularism and religious tradition. A few words about our speakers. TODD Endelman is Professor Emeritus of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. He was educated at the University of California, Berkeley, and Harvard University. He is the author of many books, most recently Leaving the Jewish Fold, Conversion and Radical Assimilation in Modern Jewish History, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Prize. He is joined today by Zvi Gitelman, who is Professor Emeritus of Political Science, and Preston R. Tisch, Professor Emeritus of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. He has written or edited 18 books, the most recent of which is the edited volume, The New Jewish Diaspora, Russian-speaking immigrants in the United States, Israel, and Germany. That was by Rutgers University Press in 2016. So thank you, TODD, thank you, Zvi, for joining us. We're just going to jump right in if we can. Our title for today is Secularism and Religious Tradition. So Zvi, if you could tell us a little bit about when and why secular Jewishness first appears on the scene.
You could make the argument that it appears with Baruch Spinoza, Benedictus de Spinoza, the 17th century Amsterdam Jew, philosopher, and his denial of the immortality of the soul and the Mosaic authorship of the Bible, that led the Jewish community of Amsterdam to expel him from its congregation. But he did not, as previous heretics had, become a Christian. So he was a person without a religious affiliation. He never denied his Jewishness, his origins, his essence, if you will, but he never became a Christian. And so he was a person without religion. And you might argue, therefore, that he is, let us say, the first secular Jew. He remains unique for a long time until the French Revolution, which begins to differentiate between citizenship, being in the French Republic, religion, being a Jew or a Catholic. And Jews begin to explore this differentiation and ask themselves the question, can one be a Jew and non-religious? And the answer is affirmative. Even back in the Talmud, it says, Yisrael af al pi shechata, Yisraelhu. A Jew who has sinned is nevertheless a Jew. And TODD has written extensively on this. We still haven't solved the issue of whether a Jew who becomes a Christian is still a Jew. And that's exemplified in two figures, one from Eastern Europe and actually both from Eastern Europe. That would be Oswald Rufeisen, who evaded murder by the Nazis, who in fact played a heroic role during the Holocaust, but became a Carmelite monk, arrived in Israel and wanted to be classified as a Jew. The second is Arène Lustiger, better known as Cardinal Jean-Marie Lustiger of Paris, who during the Holocaust, though his parents were born in Poland, was hidden in a French village and also through conviction became a Catholic. And to this day, there's a debate about whether these two people classify as Jews. But you know, we have a saying in Yiddish, wie es Christelzach, azay Idelzach, which is a pun hard to translate, but it means that as it goes with the Christians, so it goes with the Jews. And with the French Revolution, with the emergence of people like Voltaire or David Hume in Scotland, people began to pronounce themselves as non-believers, as atheists, and Jews began to do the same. So you might say that by the beginning of the 19th century, there were Jews who publicly defined themselves as secular.
And I mean, how would this, contrast to sort of the traditional way of Jewish life as it was, known to be at that time?
Well, if you bring up the first slide, this slide of the Cheder in Lublin in the 1920s, you'll be able to see that. And this is, of course, an iconic image, you might say. It's the Jewish tradition of learning. Most of these boys would not have attended much by way of secular education in Polish schools. I might note parenthetically that most of these boys probably were murdered during World War II. But here they are studying religious texts, largely by rote, guided by a melamed, a teacher. And the main purpose of this kind of education was to imbue them with religious belief, religious practice, and knowledge of the classic holy texts. The secular Jews had a very different approach. They had little regard for the holy text. They certainly did not regard them as holy. They regarded them as literature to be studied as such. And what you had was, I think, two forms of secularization. One was the individual abandonment of religion. People just moved away from the religious way of life. And you could see that possibly in the next slide, slide 5, which is a painting by another victim of the Holocaust, Bruno Schulz, in what is now Ukraine and was Poland at the time. We can discuss the meaning of the painting. to me, it evokes the rabbinic phrase, Heitzitz v'nifga. The person looked, peeked, glanced, and was stricken. Here we have a traditional Jew who sees something of the secular, outer, non-observant world. This might have been Isaac Deutscher, for example, who was a Ger Chosid in Poland in the interwar period, and who began to attend meetings of Marxists in his Hasidic garb. Eventually, he became a Trotskyite. He was purged from the Polish Communist Party as the whole party was purged in 1938, found his way to England, and without any university education, perhaps because he didn't have any university education, he became a great writer and wrote biographies of Stalin and Trotsky. So this is individual secularization. I remember in Moscow in 1966, when I spent a few months in the Soviet Union, I would daven, I would pray every Shabbos at the Moscow Choral Shul, and I would stand next to a man named Zalman, older man, and when I was about to leave the USSR, I offered him my Siddur, my prayer book, which was a rare commodity at the time. And he waved it away and he said, "Don't bother me with that nonsense. I don't believe a word of it." And I said, "Zalman, but you're in shul every Shabbos. Why are you here?" He said, "I come to hear the chazan." Well, actually, he came mostly to criticize the chazan. But he was very attracted by the cantorial music. And he asked me, he said, "Where are you going to be on Shavuos?" And I said, "Well, I'll be in Kiev." He said, "Ah, you fool, stay here. Chazan Steinberg is coming from Tashkent." So he was deeply involved in what we would superficially think of as religious Jewish life, but he didn't give a kopek for it. It kind of reminds me of a Jewish joke where a young man leaves his shtetl and goes to America. And then 10 years later, he comes back to visit his aging mother in the shtetl. And she looks at him and she hardly recognizes him. He has no beard. She says, "Zunale, wo ist dein Bord? Where's your beard?" He says, "Mame, in America, no one wears a beard." "Zunale, where's your yarmulke?" "Please, Mama, in America, they don't wear hats." And the mother says, "I see you're not wearing tzitzis anymore." "In America, we don't wear tzitzis." The mother is flabbergasted. And finally, she leans into him and whispers to him, "Sag mir, Jingale, du bist noch gemalt? Are you still circumcised?" So this is the individual falling away from religion, often caused by transposition of place and culture. The second form that secularization took was the form of movements. Bundists, not Buddhists, Bundists, Jewish social democrats, Marxists, Yiddishists, anti-Zionists, anti-clerical, and also secular Zionists. The third form was militant atheism, people who made it their cause to fight against religion. And this is depicted in this Soviet poster, which says religion is an obstacle for the 5-year plan. The 5-year plan was to develop the Soviet economy. And if you look at the yellow circle, it says, "Tritt herein im Verband von die kriegerische Abkehrung." Go into the League of the Militant Godless. This was an atheist movement in the Soviet Union. Of course, it was headed by a Jew whose pseudonym was Yemelyan Yaroslavsky, but whose real name was Israelevich Gubelman. And at the bottom right, you'll see, "Alle Religies sterben und schädigen auf ein Efen der sozialistische Beugung." All religions get in the way and harm in the same way the socialist construction. So these are militant, anti-religious. They're not limited to the Soviets. Hashomer HaTzair, which was a Marxist Zionist movement. My mother, who grew up in Jerusalem, remembers that on Pesach, on Passover, they would ride through the streets of Jerusalem, demonstratively eating bread. The anarchists in New York held balls on Yom Kippur, and so on and so forth. So these are the three forms of secularization: becoming personally irreligious, joining a movement which was a-religious, if not anti-religious, and being militantly anti-religious.
Todd, can you give us more of an individual example of how this plays out?
Yeah, I want to approach it from a somewhat different angle than Zvi did. It's not one that contradicts or opposes him, but rather complements it. You can also look at secularization in a long-term perspective as a social and cultural process that undercut or undermined or weakened religious views and religious practices. And this is a kind of secularization that was promoted by fundamental changes in the social and political world that were taking place. Things like urbanization, geographical mobility, expansion of scientific and medical knowledge, material prosperity. And I want to give a classic example of that in a text that we included in the volume. And this is from a memoir by Zvi Masliansky. Masliansky was a traditional Jew born in the Russian Empire who became, as an adult, a spellbinding orator for the Zionist movement. He traveled all over the world. And in his memoirs, he recalled different examples. He always noticed what the state of Judaism was in a particular place. And here he is commenting in this section from his memoirs about how he encounters in pre-World War London Jews who, in fact, their Judaism has since been resolved to, they like to hear the singing of Yigdal in the synagogue, and they still eat fish on Friday nights. But, and I think this is an interesting example, he says their children are so ill-educated Jewishly that when they have to say Kaddish for a parent, they have to read it in a transliteration in English letters in the back of the Siddur. Now that's a kind of non-ideological, unself-conscious secularization that affected Jews everywhere, even if they didn't join the League of Militant Atheists.
I just want to remind everyone before we move on, if you have questions, you can post those questions in the Q&A box on your screen. We will be addressing those questions when we get to the end of the session. Zvi, can you take us on in this journey and talk a little bit about the response of religious Jews to secular Jewishness?
I think there were two fundamental responses. One was to modernize the religion as they saw it. So you have, of course, Reform, later on the conservative movement, and changes even within Orthodoxy. So even in the militantly anti-Zionist, anti-secular Agudas Yisrael, the party which was very strong in interwar Poland and remains a big player in Israeli politics, although they're still not Zionist, you had changes made, youth organizations, women's organizations formed. Rev Meir Shapiro, who was a member of the Aguda, he established a new kind of yeshiva, Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin, in that Polish city, the city of Lublin, which had a big, beautiful building, which still stands today, with a dormitory and with a attention paid to good food, good sanitation, and so on. And this was an attempt to compete with the winds of secularization that were blowing through the Jewish world. The second basic posture towards secularism was to shun it absolutely and to build a kind of fortress Judaism around Orthodoxy, which would resist any change at all. A good example is the travels of the Rebbe Chaim Eliezer Shapira of Munkach. Munkach is today Mukachevo in Transcarpathian Ukraine. and with a strong Hungarian influence, the Munkach Hasidim were even more extreme than the Satmara. So when the Rebbe traveled in Palestine and Israel in 1930, he deliberately avoided going to Tel Aviv because Tel Aviv was secular Sin City. He would not even meet with the chief rabbi of Mandatory Palestine, Harav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, and he wouldn't refer to him by name. He would call him Oisoi Ha'ish, meaning that man. And that was an appellation that had traditionally been used to refer to Jesus. In his mind, Rabbi Cook, who was certainly an Orthodox rabbi, but was a Zionist, was treif posel, was completely illegitimate because he welcomed secularist Jews into his fold and he blessed them for the Zionist work that they were doing. So these are two kinds of radically different approaches to secularism: adaptation and rejection.
And looking back to secularism itself, what were the differences in secular Jewishness in different parts of the world, first of all, between Western Europe and Eastern Europe? You already mentioned Palestine, land of Israel. So, how did secular Jewishness present itself in those different environments?
Speaking in great generalities and superficialities, I would say that in Western Europe and in North America, and especially in Latin America, there were few militantly secular movements. What you had instead were non-religious, a-religious movements. B'nai Brith, B'nai Zion, the Knights of Pythias, Brith Abraham, the Free Sons of Israel, the United Order of True Sisters. These were fraternal or sororal organizations which took no position on religion, did not advocate it, nor did they oppose it. But in Eastern Europe and in Israel, which, let us remember, in this interwar period was dominated by East European Jews, there were distinctly secular ideologies and movements, such as those I mentioned earlier. Now, these movements were not simply political parties. They really were all-encompassing movements. They had summer camps, they had schools, newspapers, labor exchanges. In Israel, even housing was built in the interwar period according to political parties, and their members would go and live in that particular place. I remember as a kid going to a Hebrew-speaking camp, which was politically neutral and religiously mixed. I remember Camp Shomria, which was the camp of the Shomer HaTzair, absolutely treif, quite anti-religious. Then you had Habonim, which was sort of the parve socialists of the Mapai party, of the Labor Party in Israel. And you had Kinderland. Kinderland was frankly communist. Boiberik, which was politically neutral but Yiddishist. Hemshech, the camp of the Bund, which means continuation. Well, for better or for worse, the Bund never continued. Newspapers. I remember the Freiheit, the communist Yiddish newspaper, the Morgen Journal, which was the modern Orthodox paper, Der Eid, which was the Satmar anti-Zionist paper. The Forwitz, of course, was the largest of them all, and it was nominally socialist. It had a circulation of about 250,000, which meant that it was read perhaps by 500,000 people. The TODD, which eventually merged with the Morgen Journal, which is what we read at home. The TODD was a Zionist paper. So you live your whole life, really, within the parameters of the movement and the ideology. And that was true of Eastern Europe for the most part, for a brief time in the United States, and certainly in Mandatory Palestine.
I would add to what Zvi just said, that even in Eastern Europe, where secularization or secularism as a Jewish ideology flourished, even there you find the kind of individual non-ideological secularization. Secularization is a process that I was talking about before. And I want to give another example from a text that we've included in the Posen volume. And this is a selection from the memoirs of Meir Berlin, or Bar Ilan, after he Hebraized his name. Bar Ilan was the leader of the Mizrahi movement, that is to say, the Orthodox but Zionist stream, and he settled in Jerusalem in the 1920s. He wrote his memoirs, published in 1933, and he recalled examples from his youth that go a long way to explaining how even traditional Jews, people who would have denied really that they were in any way influenced by secularization, nonetheless were. And he gave this wonderful example about his grandfather telling him that when his grandfather would see a train, he would say, "Ah, there's the Apikoros." And now Apikoros means a heretic, someone who denies everything. And what did he mean? He meant that this transformation in the material circumstances of traditional Russian Jews brought them into contact with new worlds, which by definition had to make some changes in their lives, either by offering new economic opportunities or indirectly simply by changing the environment, particularly by encouraging mobility. And the value of Meir Bar Ilan's statement or excerpt is that it shows us how oftentimes changes that in a sense were no way directed at Jewish life, nonetheless could have very unintended consequences for that kind of life. And this kind of, if you will, non-ideological secularization was probably just as prominent in Eastern Europe as it was in Western Europe. And it coexisted along with the kind of ideological secularism that Zvi has been talking about.
So you've shared with us really the response in the Western world, both in Eastern Europe and Western Hemisphere. What about the large Jewish population in Islamic lands at this very same time? Do we see any manifestations there?
No, because in the Ottoman Empire, which ruled much of what we now consider the Middle East, there was a so-called millet system, which designated people by their religion and not by their ethnicity. And people thought of themselves primarily as members of a religious group. For example, I would say that had you approached a person anywhere in the empire at the time, as late as even the 1940s or 50s, and you asked, "Who are you?" the answer would not be, "I'm an Iraqi, I'm a Jordanian, I'm a Palestinian," but rather, "I'm a Muslim, I'm a Jew, I'm a Christian." That was the primary identity recognized by the Ottoman authorities, who held the heads of those religious communities responsible for those communities. They, for example, appointed among the Jews, anywhere in the empire, a Chacham Bashi, a chief rabbi. And that's how we get, at least in part, that's how we get the Israeli institution of the chief rabbinate. And this begins to change. George Antonius writes a book in 1938 called The Arab Awakening. And in this book, he describes how Arabs are coming more and more to ethnic rather than religious self-consciousness, not so much because of secularization, but because nationalism, perhaps best exemplified by Gamal Abdel Nasser, rises and captures the hearts of people living in those lands. So that today, a person will answer, "Who are you?" by saying, "I'm Syrian, I'm Lebanese, I'm Moroccan." And there was no, in our period, there was no secularism, except perhaps for a small group of communists, particularly in Iraq, among the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa.
I'd add a historical dimension to this as well. Jews living in the orbit of Islam never underwent the traumatic experiences of emancipation. They were never forced to resolve the tension between traditional Judaism and the demands of living in a modern nation state, because there were not modern nation states in the Middle East until, well, sometime in the 20th century. That part explains why Reform Judaism never took a root in the Islamic or in Islam, Jewish communities in Islamic lands, because Jews living there never had to prove that they were, quote, Syrians of the Mosaic persuasion. Citizenship was simply not an issue, and it wasn't tied to identification with a local populace. Now, to say that is to say that there was no kind of organized secularism, is not to say that secularization didn't occur. And this is the point I've been making several times this evening. Secularization was underway, certainly by the mid-19th century, but it occurred outside of any kind of ideological context. And again, let me give you an example from a text that we've included in the Posen volume. In 1860, an organization was established in Paris called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And the Alliance Israélite Universelle was a philanthropic and charitable organization whose goal was to turn the Jews of the Ottoman Empire and North Africa into French-speaking Westernized Jews, that is, it presumed a degree of secularization. And in this text that you have before you, you can see this is a letter that was written from Tangier, from the city of Sousse in Tunisia. And it's a plea to the Central Committee in Paris to create a French-speaking, modernized, but nonetheless still religious school in the city. And what bothers the person who's writing this letter is that he's absolutely dismayed by the degree of secularization he sees among the young people when he goes to services on Yom Kippur. And in fact, when he finds out, when he leaves he needs a little air, he finds the atmosphere a little bit stifling, he walks outside to a kind of a terrace, and that's where most of them are hanging out. So he believes the establishment of an Alliance school. Now, again, this was secularization without any effort. It's not tied to any effort to achieve emancipation or indeed to be anything but Jewish. It's simply secularization, moving away from the world of the sacred and the world of religion.
And Todd, just a couple of quick follow-ups on that. I mean, I know if you read memoirs of folks, of Jews who were living particularly in the big cities in the Arab world, modernization was clearly afoot. And, so this process you're describing, is that simply an outgrowth of more of the economic modernization more than anything else, and encountering a world that didn't demand certain behaviors?
Yeah, it is very much so. It has to do with the quickening of economic life, the coming of the European colonial powers to North Africa and elsewhere in the Middle East, exposure to new ways of thinking. But for the Jews who were relinquishing aspects of Jewish tradition, it was not part of a campaign to become Arabs or Iraqis or Muslims or anything else. That is to say, it was secularization within the Jewish community, within the parameters of an all-Jewish world. And
would either of you say that this lack of sort of organized secularism that you see in the, let's call it the Ashkenazic world more broadly, did that lead to even a further layer of conflict when the Jews from the Islamic world found their way to Israel, post 48, where you have, this secular part of the country had been established?
Well, I would say that, in fact, it made it easier, because when they found themselves in Israel, they were able to remain attached in loose or in less, in looser ways to Jewish tradition, and at the same time still participate in the largely secular culture. The example is the Mizrahi Jew who goes to the synagogue in the morning and goes to a soccer game, football game in the afternoon on Shabbat. And it doesn't cause him any particular inner conflict.
But let's not forget.
In that sense, it was a benefit to not having had to go through the emancipation problem and the adjustment problems that Jews in Europe did with nation states.
But let's not forget that the dominant secular population, and particularly the Mapai party, tried to wean the traditional religious Jews from Islamic lands away from religion, so that Yemenites who came had their peyot cut off. Kids were sent to secular kibbutzim to be raised away from their parents. There's even a major scandal whose full story has never been told, the kidnapping of the Yemenite children and taking them away from their parents in order to be raised in secular homes. So there is a tension between the traditionalists and the secularists, and that falls along geographical and cultural lines.
Yeah.
The secularism is mainly among the European origin Israelis, and the traditionalism mainly among the Edot HaMizrach or Sfaradim, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, but wouldn't you say that those efforts on the part of secularizing Labor Party members were largely ineffectual? That is, they didn't break the link.
That's a question we're going to come to.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, if we have time, we're definitely going to come back to this. Is still a relevant issue today,
right,
in many ways. Zvi, if you could talk a little bit about how these advocates of a secular form of Jewishness dealt with largely religion-based side of Jewish culture, holidays, language, expressions, traditions, other customs, for example.
Ambivalently. So, for example, in secular Jewish summer camps, pretty much across the board, the campers would dress up in white on Friday. They wouldn't attend any Jewish service, any religious service. They wouldn't observe Shabbat in any way or form, but there was something special. It's like in the text that Todd quoted from Masliansky. Well, they still eat fish on Friday night, and maybe they'll sing something which is vaguely connected to religion. But they had an easy time with the Jewish holidays, because the Jewish holidays are open to interpretation. If you take Passover, well, could be the liberation by God and Moses from Egypt, but it also could be the liberation of the oppressed from slavery, not necessarily with any divine intervention. Shavuot, Sukkot, these are agricultural holidays. And on secular kibbutzim, that's the way they're celebrated. We've done it. We've got a crop. Has nothing to do with any divine intervention from the heavens above. Of course, you do have a problem with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. These are purely theological holidays, and they're not connected neither to historical events nor to anything concrete and material. So what some of the most militant of the secularists did was to have anti-religious celebrations on those days, as I've mentioned, Yom Kippur, balls. My wife and I, when we were in Tel Aviv in 1971-72, we came home during a break from shul on Yom Kippur, and we hear loud banging. What's this on Yom Kippur? Sure enough, in the building we were living in, we saw a bunch of kids building a sukkah. This is what the Talmud calls tovel v'sheretz biado. Dafke, on a holiday when you're not supposed to engage in construction, they are building a booth which has as its origins, at least, a religious commandment. Of course, we noticed during Sukkot there was simply a place to play cards for these kids. My favorite one was we came home, I think it was Rosh Hashanah, and across the street we heard a fantastic chazan, and I said, Marlene, why didn't we go to that shul? That guy is terrific. And we listened a little bit more closely, and it turned out that someone was listening to cantorial records on a phonograph. That's how he was celebrating Rosh Hashanah. So there are various ways that one can reject entirely, observe entirely, or kind of synthesize religion and secularism.
I'd like to point out some different kind of synthesis that takes place and talk about Jewish intellectuals who were religious figures who accepted Western civilization, but somehow could not escape the influence of secular ideas. Now, to say that they're unable to escape them, it's not to say they abandoned observance or belief. They didn't, but rather they managed to incorporate them or synthesize them. An example I want to give is, again, from another text that we've included. Louis Finkelstein spent most of his entire career at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he was the chancellor, essentially the leader of the conservative movement in the United States in much of the middle decades of the past century. In 1938, Finkelstein, who was a rabbinic scholar, published a book called The Pharisees, The Sociological Background of Their Faith. Now, in fact, the subtitle to the book is a giveaway to the kind of secular influence that was being exerted here. The Pharisees play a key role in the transformation of Judaism from a sacrifice-centric, temple-oriented religion to the kind of text-based, synagogue-oriented religion that we know today. So they're key figures in the creation of Judaism as we know it. One of their concepts that they introduced into Judaism, but was not found in the Bible before this, was Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. Finkelstein came up with I would say, what is both a left-wing socialist kind of answer as to why they embraced it, and one that reflected his immersion in scholarship. Now, you have to remember the 1930s and 1920s were a period in, I would say, Jewish life in general, where left-wing ideas had a greater hold on everyone than, let's say, within the secular world. And Finkelstein also had embraced some of these ideas. And the interpretation he came up with is that, in fact, the Pharisees were popular, as they attracted the support of artisans and traders because they wanted some sort of compensation, some sort of recompense in an ideal world for the fact that they were suffering in this world. So the idea of resurrection of the dead offered them the possibility of future reward. It is really a very democratic idea of redemption. It wasn't just for the elite. It wasn't just for the priests in the temple, or it wasn't just for the Sadducees. It rather was available to everyone. So he gives us really a left-wing explanation for the growth and development of Pharisaic Judaism. And this is how he combined these two kinds of worlds. Now, there's another example that I want to give, and this is entirely different. It's from the world of art. In the period that Zvi and I are dealing with in this volume, one of the strong characteristics was a Jewish appropriation of Christian symbols and figures, not by religious Jews, but by secular Jews. Now, on the one hand, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for two reasons. If they were secular Jews, why did they want to appropriate religious figures? And if they were secular, if they were Jews, why Christian figures. This is an example from a well-known artist of the period named Hanoch or Henryk Barshinsky. He was a Polish Jew, but who studied in Germany and lived and worked in both countries. This is a linocut of John the Baptist that he did in 1919, and it appeared in a Yiddish journal. Now, there are a number of things to notice about this. Working in an expressionist style, he has given us a John the Baptist who is in no way spiritual or religious. He has totally secularized it. There's nothing in any sense that would suggest that this is John the Baptist. There's no hint here that this is someone who is offering or prefigures someone who is going to be offering heavenly salvation. In fact, if you look at it closely, this is a very strong, muscular figure, a bit of a starker. It could be a butcher, a carter, a blacksmith, but certainly not a spiritual Christian figure. And what's going on is a Jewish secularist, like other Jewish secularists, particularly among the artists, were reclaiming Christians as Jews. And essentially, they were saying to the Christian world, all of your spiritual figures are really need to be recast as that they really were, that is, they were Jews. And certainly in the case of John the Baptist, since he precedes Jesus of Nazareth. But there's something else going on as well, and Zvi alluded to this before. And here you find secularists offering a very expansive definition of who is a Jew and of what is Jewishness. In this case, they're saying dissent trumps religious observance or religious belief or any kind of spiritual notions. And it's really an attack on this linocut of John the Baptist. In part is an attack on conventional notions of what is Jewish respectability, what is Jewish piety. And you find this very example here, this extraordinary example. But this was very common among Jewish artists. An example that many of you may be more familiar with is the so-called white crucifixion of Marc Chagall, which is in Chicago.
Thanks, Todd. Zvi, I want to take us back, to your introduction for us to the notion of militant atheism, and did that work, particularly in the USSR and in Israel, where there were very aggressive attempts to make it happen?
I'll give you an academic answer: yes and no.
Please elaborate.
What seems to have happened in the USSR, and we discovered this only after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was that religious knowledge disappeared among Christians, Jews, and Muslims, but belief in a higher being, some call it God, not survived and remains to this day. So a lot of post-Soviet sociologists and others have studied the beliefs of people, which they could not do freely in the Soviet period. And they discovered, roughly speaking, 45 to 60% of the interviewees believe in some kind of higher power, something we might call God, but they do not observe religious practices. And the clergy of these various faiths bemoan that. They bemoan two things: complete lack of knowledge of the tenets of the religion, which is not surprising since religious education was unavailable for 70 years, and the lack of practice of religious rituals and traditions. I and two Russian colleagues did a major interview project in the early and late 1990s in 8 cities of Russia and Ukraine. And among our 7,000 respondents, we found, and these were Jews, we found about 1/4 believed in God, Another quarter said they were leaning towards such a belief. And a third quarter said they absolutely did not believe. And the last quarter, of course, said they didn't know. So you have, to me, it was a surprising number of people who were believers in some sort of higher power. I guess in American lingo, you would say they were somewhat spiritual rather than religious. In Israel, secularization worked very well, but mostly not because of militant secularism. In Israel, it's easy to be Jewish without being religious. And a friend of mine, an American immigrant to Israel, said, yeah, in America, in order to be Jewish, I had to go to synagogue. Here, what do I need the synagogue for? I'm obviously Jewish. Israeli Jews, who comprise about 70–75% of the Israeli population, speak a Jewish language, the original Jewish language. Their lives are regulated by a Jewish calendar. The holidays of the state are mainly religious in origin. And Saturday, not Sunday or Friday, is the day of rest. So in a sense, while many Israeli Jews are secular, nevertheless, it's not because they have been persuaded to be anti-religious. Perhaps they've come to the realization that it's okay to be a-religious or non-religious, but that in no way diminishes their Jewish identity. That is not true in the diaspora.
So now let's look at the United States as a different environment. So what did secular Jewishness look like in America? And then you can sort of take that up to what does it look like today in America? Do we still see any such thing?
My brief answer is azochen veh, woe betide us. That's a highly subjective judgment with which many will disagree. Secular Jewishness in the United States was once what I would call a thick culture, a vibrant, living culture which influenced the way people lived each and every day. There were Yiddish schools, Yiddish newspapers, camps, which I've mentioned. There were theaters in both Yiddish and Hebrew. Many children spoke Hebrew, not because they were Israeli, but because it was an ideal, not because they were religious, but because they wanted to be culturally Jewish. And culture in most parts of the world does not mean reading the Sunday Times and eating bagels and lox at the same time. It means language, dress, food, music, practices. In the 1950s, Will Herberg wisely, I think, called Judaism a facade for ethnicity. Now, today, fewer and fewer Jews affiliate religiously, and probably fewer believe religiously. Jewish culture in America, what's its content? No language, no territory, no distinctive dress, maybe some foods, maybe some music. It's a very thin ethnicity, or as Herbert Gans, another sociologist, called it, symbolic ethnicity. And it doesn't pass from one generation to another in a majority of instances. That's debatable, but I'll put it out there. It is transformed in Israel because there it transformed into a political and state identity. Living in a Jewish state with a Jewish language, Jewish calendar and territory, as I mentioned earlier.
I'd like to add to that as something about the differences about in the world we live in today and the world of the 1920s and 1930s. secular Jewishness today is anemic. It's essentially, it doesn't exist, certainly not as a movement. And I think a lot of the reason can be explained by the differences between the Jewish communities of the two times. In the 1920s and 1930s, Jews were under siege everywhere, in the sense that they were all forced to define for themselves what it meant to be Jewish, because it was always being questioned. Who was a Jew? Where is a Jew? Do Jews have a right to be here, to be integrated into society? And those conditions disappeared after the Second World War. And as a consequence, the Jewish community in America is not particularly politicized. It's politicized in the sense that it can be rallied for the Republicans, in some cases for the, in some cases for the Republicans and usually for the Democrats, but not politicized around Jewish political parties or Jewish political movements. And as a consequence, there's much less a need for a Jew to define who he or she is, and also to declare what he or she is not. So secularists in the Jewish world today go about their business, and no one really cares one way or the other. Unlike the secularists from the interwar period who really wanted to change the world, that is to say, those who were part of a movement and thought of transforming the world in a certain way, in a way that they saw as a secular form of Jewishness. And to bring in, to add to something Zvi said, one of the great difficulties with secular Judaism of any form is its impossibility of transmitting a secular Jewish identity over several generations. Yiddishism is not an option in the diaspora. That is, historically, it was not successful anywhere in the West. And once specifics like language go, there's little to pass on. That is to say, the things that can be passed on have to be particularistic. Liberalism, which many Jews would define as the essence of Judaism, does not distinguish Jews from other people. To maintain an identity, a people needs a particularistic identity and have practices, rites, celebrations, beliefs, texts that are different from everyone else. And it's very interesting, one of the great chroniclers of secular Judaism in America in the immigrant years and in the 20s and 30s, Irving Howe. Irving Howe was very much a man of the Yiddish-speaking world and a man of the left. Howe once said to me that, and this was 30, 40 years ago, that he could see only two viable options for Jews: either making aliyah, that is settling in the land of Israel, where being Jewish is no longer a problem. One doesn't have to, one just live there. And one is Jewish by virtue of the language one speaks, by virtue of the people one intersects with, by virtue of the calendar. And he said religious observance. Now that was a surprising admission from someone who came from the world of Jewish secularism. But he realized it was no longer a viable alternative. It simply couldn't exist. And I think history has proven his prognosis correct. Zvi said it's debatable whether you can pass on a secular Jewish identity. I wrote a book about this called Leaving the Jewish Fold, which dealt with conversion and radical assimilation in the modern period. And I didn't even think it was much of a question, because it became obvious as you look at the record of Jewish history over really since the 1800 up to the present, that Howe is right in the long term. That religious observance or aliyah could be the only possible thing. So the world we're describing and the world we've been talking about and the texts we've been bringing to bear are really part of a world that doesn't exist any longer and would be almost impossible to recreate, at least in the diaspora.
I'm going to start channeling some of the questions that have been coming in and really picking up on what you just said, Todd. So there is a question that came in referencing, and we know these are small numbers, minority movements today, things like humanistic Judaism, and you could even sort of go back to something like Society for Ethical Culture if you want to go back to the era that you're more deeply talking about. But I also want to add to that, and this really connects to your description of thickness, Zvi. Do you think Howe would have, when he talks about religious as an option, would he have included the non-Orthodox in his understanding of a viable modality? Would he have said that sort of religious across the board, you could be Reformed, conservative, or would he have in mind, actually, when you really think about it and unpack it, if you're not all in a very traditional way, it's going to get thinner, to use Zvi's language?
Well, he didn't specify.
I know, I'm asking you.
But my interpretation would be, he certainly was excluding reform. And maybe some more observant conservative Jews would have been included. But he really meant observance, performance. He meant doing things that other people don't do. And that's the distinction, particularism.
Zvi, any follow-up on that?
No, I think Todd said it all.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to one of the first questions that came in. We've been using this term, secular Jewishness, not necessarily secular Judaism, that those could be seen as more in conflict. Where did this term first come up? Was this something that was intentional by those who espoused it, or is this more of a sociological, anthropological approach where we as scholars say this is what it is?
In Eastern Europe, the term comes up in Yiddish, certainly, weltliche Yiddishkeit. Weltlich meaning not exactly secular, but rooted in this world with no thought to another future world. Actually, the word used in Yiddish is very similar to the word used in Polish. So they were consciously self-identifying as Jews of this world, secular Jews.
Another question, what role do either of you think that moving to places where there were other religious options played in people's leaving Judaism? So maybe this is, really for Todd and the work that he's done, not necessarily becoming secular, but switching out into something else, having that option.
That was conversion to Christianity in the modern period by Jews had almost nothing to do with religion. They were what we could call secular conversions or conversions of convenience. The Jews converted because they didn't want to bear the stigma of a Jewish identity, because they were socially ambitious, because they're economically ambitious, because they wanted to be a judge or a professor, if we're talking about Germany or Austria, all kinds of other things, because they wanted to live in Moscow or St. Petersburg in the Tsarist regime. And if they converted to Christianity, they would not have to have any of the restrictions that put on them. There's a distortion. People, when you talk about converted Jews, they think of Jews for whom it was really a sincere conversion. But the Cardinal Lustiger's are really the exception among the hundreds of thousands of Jews who left Judaism. And indeed, their conversion is a testimony to the power of secularism. That is, they went from being Jews who didn't go to synagogue, they went to becoming Christians who didn't go to church. But having that designation of Christian, at least in theory, solved all kinds of problems for them.
As Heinrich Heine famously had said.
Yeah.
Take us another contemporary question. Would you comment in any way that or suggest that Reconstructionism as it exists today and the various Jewish spirituality movements, and again, I'll throw in here humanistic Judaism as a contemporary movement, not something from decades ago, are these, in their own way, attempts to sort of fill this secular void, or are they looking for something else?
Well, I'm a historian. I'm not very good about projecting the future. But you can understand the growth of Reconstructionist Judaism because it really matched the sociological nature of American Jewry from the 1920s on. That is a community that was increasingly bound together by ethnic ties rather than by spiritual ties. And Mordecai Kaplan's work is an example of someone who remained within the Jewish fold, a Jewish religious leader, but who was very much influenced by the secularization of America.
I would only add to that, I agree with your premise. This is an attempt to deal with challenges to religion. But I would ask, what proportion of American Jewry affiliates with the Reconstructionist movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a challenge when, people throw, these are essentially the exceptions that prove the rule when, these relatively small groups, you could even call them marginal, are put out there as examples to say, sort of challenging your premise, but I think they prove your premise more than anything else. So I would agree with that. Question that comes up, and this actually, we haven't seen it in the conversation today, roles of women in any of these secular movements.
Part of the agenda, it wasn't very prominent. And in retrospect, it's exaggerated because people tend to look at the past through the prism of the present. But part of the agenda of the socialist movements, without being too vociferous about it, was to give women the franchise, but it was part of a broader effort to broaden, for example, the kihilot, the communal institutions, which were dominated, first of all, were exclusively male, and which were dominated by the rich and the learned. So movements such as the Bund advocated opening up the franchise, which meant actually voting and serving on communal committees, to the working class, women, men, learned, unlearned. Some of the early Bundists were indeed women, and this was true also of the Zionist movement. So this was not invented 50 years ago. This goes back, at least in Eastern Europe, and certainly in North America, to the 19th century.
Great, thanks. So this is a question, a little bit of a comment built into it. Question about the volume. Have you used photographs in the volume? And particularly, this is a response to your comment about the loss of the beard, even among Hasidim, where you can see some old family photos where the parents appear traditional, and then you have the next generation looking a little different. Comment says in the yeshivot in Lithuania, a beard was usual in the interwar period, but the beard disappears even among the older Orthodox generation in the US, really in the interwar period, and then reappears into the 1990s. So is this acculturation when they're losing the beard, or secularization?
The first part of the question is easier to answer, and that is, do we use photographs? We do, but we chose the photographs not largely on the basis of how they portrayed social trends like we're talking about, or religious trends, but rather in terms of their artistic contribution. And so there were many Jewish photographers in this period whose work we've included, but it's not because they're telling a story that we want to tell, it's because they're making an aesthetic statement.
It's a very good question, and it is, in fact, a good indicator of changes over time. I've seen a group photograph of the students of the Ponevezh Yeshiva, I believe it was 1937. Ponevezh is a town in Lithuania, which had a great yeshiva, which then moved to Bnei Brak in Israel. Among all the students, and there must have been about 40 of them in the group picture, only about 3 or 4, one of whom was Rav Shach, a great religious, ultra-Orthodox authority in Israel later on, had a beard. black hats were not in fashion until post-war United States. And I won't name any names, but when I was in yeshiva high school, there were some young rabbeim, teachers in the yeshiva, who were clean shaven. 15 years later, they all had beards. It wasn't because they had matured physiologically.
Zvi, to what extent do you see sort of the shift backwards? And again, I know we're looking at this historically, but I'm asking you to think a little bit contemporaneously as well. You could argue that the thickness of Jewish life that you described was also an outgrowth of essentially a very dense population in some of these places, right? So allowed for sort of a very thick Jewish life by osmosis, if you will, until those generations moved out and post-war weren't replaced by new immigrants. And then things really started to thin out. And then maybe the resurgence, particularly on the more Orthodox side of the spectrum, is the only way to recapture that thickness, if you will. Do you see any, progression of that sort?
You remember when Todd put up the quote from Masliansky about how the railroad changed the way of life? Well, so did the suburbs. And the lack of a dense Jewish neighborhood, as you mentioned. Of course, there's also what I would use the German term, Alltagsleben, daily life. The daily life in a thick Jewish neighborhood in Dexter Davison in Detroit, or the Lower East Side, or parts of the Bronx and Brooklyn in New York, and so on and so forth, exerted a certain social pressure on people, and conformity resulted. So people went along with that way of life. The automobile, the suburb, liberated people to some extent from that pressure. And so outward religiosity, which was a product not of faith, of conviction, but rather of this is the way we do things, that begins to dissipate.
Yeah, sociologists have a name for that. They call it milieu piety.
Milieu piety, yes.
Yeah, and in fact, they would argue that a lot of the piety of Eastern Europe was milieu piety. And when many of the immigrants came to the New World, that is to New York, wherever, they changed because the surroundings they found themselves were nowhere near as stringent in terms of belief as they'd been accustomed to.
And some recent films have demonstrated that this is still the case in certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
All right, we have a few more questions, actually, a lot that have been coming in, so I'm going to try to see if we can condense a few of them. To what extent were these movements then, and anything you might still see today of this sort, really just a generation gap? The younger generation rebelling against their parents and everything they stood for.
Well, that was certainly true in Eastern Europe. Some years ago, a remarkable cache of essays was discovered in Poland, and the YIVO Institute in New York originated in Wilno, as it was called then, 1925 in Poland. Today it's Vilnius, capital of Lithuania. In 1938 or 39, they announced a contest for which the prize would be 100 zloty, I believe, for young people to write about their lives. And they got, if memory serves, over 300 or maybe many more essays submitted. I believe 300 or so survived the war. And some of those have been translated from Polish and Yiddish and Hebrew into English, and they're available. And kids, young people in their early 20s, for the most part, tell about their lives. One of the dominant themes is the age gap. I don't understand my mother, and my mother doesn't understand me. My father is very pious, very poor, and he doesn't understand why I've become a Marxist Zionist. We fight in the house all the time. So this indeed was a widespread phenomenon, especially in the Soviet Union, where the older generation, to some extent, clung to its pre-revolutionary traditions. Almost none of the post-revolutionary generations did so. The tragedy of that essay contest was that the prize was to be awarded on the 1st of September, 1939, the day the war broke out. Clearly, most of the people who wrote those essays did not survive.
It's actually a few questions, and this is a natural segue from that. Question: wondering what role anti-Semitism has to play in this story, and I would say, like, we can think of this in two ways, in terms of pushing people towards secularism as some way to accommodate and, in their minds at least, avoid the threats of anti-Semitism, and then at the same time, is it indeed, as many have argued, that the persistence of anti-Semitism is a force for the persistence of Jewish identity and communal engagement, secular or otherwise, and that without that, to what you were talking about, Todd, earlier, particularly in the United States, with the weakening of anti-Semitism post-war, that is maybe a key factor in addition to everything else that must be taken into consideration when you think about the weakening of these structures.
Anti-Semitism can play both roles. It can, in some instances, act as a kind of way of reviving Jewish consciousness, but it can also erode it at the same time as well. The hundreds of thousands of Jews who left the Jewish fold between, let's say, 1800 and 1945 or 1933 would not have done so if emancipation had worked. That is to say, if Jews had been accepted into society and Judaism and Jewishness had acquired a recognition and a legitimacy that Jews wanted it. So it could work either way. It's hard to say. It depends on the time and the place. I know it's not a very, it's not a definitive answer, but you can't give a definitive answer. Even in the United States, if you want to look at it this way, anti-Semitism, let's say in the 20s and 30s, probably fueled a lot of drift from Judaism. There were Jews who said, I don't want to be identified as a Jew. Jewish religion marks me out as particular, as singular, as different, whatever. And I'll change my name and I'll change my milieu, whatever. So that in that case, it probably didn't keep. I would go back to what Zvi said before. It was the existence of Jewish neighborhoods, of dense Jewish communities that kept people Jewish, much more than anti-Semitism playing a role one way or the other.
In the United States, the World Series often overlapped with the high holidays, and Jews who went to services often also followed the games. It goes back to your very different population, but your description of some of the Mizrahi population in Israel. So how do you interpret this? Is this a syncretic religious pattern? Is it a form of secularism in some way?
It's
I
evidence
want
of
to exaggerate the depth of this issue, but I can tell you how it was solved in the East Bronx in the 1950s, where most of us were Yankee fans and had to play the hated Dodgers. So Macy's was selling televisions, and they put televisions in the windows in order to sell them. So people would take a break from shul, run up to Macy's, come back and report. It's the bottom of the fifth. The Yankees are ahead 8-5. That's how we solve the problem.
Todd?
I was just going to say, it is an example of not of secularism, but of secularization.
I'm sure that anyone who's been through that when their team is playing, probably has some story. I mean, for me, it was the custodial staff who had the radio going, in the back, and there was sort of a stream of folks making their way back there to check up on the score. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, so a couple of questions about sort of demographic trends, and how that could impact, particularly the growth in the Orthodox community, especially the ultra-Orthodox community. Does this sort of push, and maybe this goes back, Todd, again to your comment from How, is that ultimately what you're left with? Sort of radical assimilation and radical observance, if you will.
I wouldn't put it quite as starkly, but it's clear everywhere in the West that traditional Jewish communities, or strictly observant Jewish communities, are strengthening the Jewish people demographically, in some places more than others. But it's not just a question of their adherence to the mitzvot, or their practice of Judaism. It also has to do with things like they are less acculturated to the patterns of life. That is to say, they have more children. They do not practice birth control or practice it in a very easygoing manner, so that they have many more children, and that's partly what's doing it. Now, what the consequences of that will be, nobody can know. As a short term, you can say that will increase the number of Jews. But long term, there's always been leakage from the Jewish community and leakage from those who are observant to the ranks of the non-observant. So it's a question of how you project the future, and I think that's impossible to do. I'm a historian. As I often say, I'm a historian. If I could project the future, I would have become a stockbroker, But so I don't indulge in projections about the future.
The flip side of the coin is the non-strictly Orthodox. They're very low birth rates, and they're very high and increasing rates of intermarriage.
Yeah.
So there was a high proportion of Jews involved in a movement which somehow has faded from consciousness: zero population growth. This is after 1 million Jewish children were murdered in the Shoah. We're going to lead the movement to have fewer children. And of course, with more than half of Jews who are not Orthodox marrying non-Jews, and the tendency of their children not to identify as Jews, growth on one side is more than compensated for by loss on the other. Just one footnote to what Todd said, what he called the leakage. I have the impression, and I don't know of any serious data on this, that there was much more defection from the Orthodox ranks in the interwar period, about which our volume is, than there is today. And we can have a long discussion about why the rate of defection seems to have declined, but I don't think we have the time for this at present.
So I'll give you one last question, not to do with America, but we had the conversation earlier about Israel and what the ultimate fate of the sort of militant secularist atheist was there. What do you make of the phenomenon? I haven't, again, sort of the data, how widespread is this, but it's clearly a phenomenon that even in Tel Aviv of today, not Bnei Brak, but Tel Aviv itself, you have these movements of non-Orthodox, non-practicing, returning to engagement with Jewish text and with Jewish traditions in a way that would make many of their grandparents, right, roll over in their grave, as it were. So is this just things coming in a circle in a way that nobody can ever predict, or is there something else to make of it? It's observational. It's not a scholarly question.
It isn't.
I have no comment. I don't know.
Well, there are, obviously different interpretations or responses, none of which is based on empirical fact. And as more or less a social scientist, I can't take them seriously. One is nostalgia, or the third generation phenomenon. Another is the battle's over. The battle's been won. You don't have the same hostility nor the same knowledge as the militant secularists have. And there's the thing that they call the Aron HaSfarim HaYehudi, the body of Jewish literature, which I'll put in a plug. The Posen library of 10 volumes aims to be, in a certain sense. There's an enormous tradition. There's an enormous, heavy piece of cultural baggage which we bear, and of which most Jews in the world today, even in the Jewish state, are ignorant. Why not recapture that? Why should we privilege other cultures over our own? Doesn't mean I have to believe in all its premises, but I'd like to be acquainted with it.
So perhaps some of the thickness you were talking about earlier, it's not just what people were doing. That is an important part of it, but there's a knowledge base. There's a literacy element to it. And, when you're giving this response, you think about those of us who study these things, some of the most militant of the secularists knew, more Jewish texts, certainly than I ever will. And that is an interesting part of the story.
I was always embarrassed at the Library and Archives of the Jewish Labor Bund on 78th Street in Madison in New York, when I, ostensibly a yeshiva bacher of some sort, was doing research there. The archivist, who was a Bundist, man born in Konin in Poland, the same town as Barry Goldwater's ancestors came from, would say to me, Gitelman, du gedenkst, was die Gemara sagt in Gitten, you remember what the Talmud says in the tractate about divorces on such and such page? And I would say, yeah, sure. Could you give me the other brochure? He knew a heck of a lot more than I would ever know. But it stopped with that generation.
So with that, we'll wrap up. But thank you, Zvi. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Posen Library, for putting this all together. I invite everyone to join us next week, again with David Roskis and Samuel Casso, Challenges to Establishing a Jewish State. That is all for today. Thank you both again for sharing your insights and wisdom with all of us.